Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about Russian oil, because there have been a number of developments, negative developments from Russia's point of view. Firstly, Ukraine has now started targeting Russian shadow fleet tankers. So if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Ukraine has stepped up its drone attacks on Russia. So it's been targeting oil and gas infrastructure actually located within Russia. So it's trying to hurt the Russian economy rather than trying to push back against the forces. It's trying to take out some of the revenue that Russia is earning, which it's using to continue funding the war in Ukraine. And Ukraine has now ramped these attacks up to target tankers. So not just oil and gas infrastructure in Russia, but actual Russian tankers that are sailing in the sea. And it's been reported that 3 separate attacks have taken place over the past few days. 2 Russian shadow fleet tankers that were on their way back to Russia were actually in Turkish waters at the time, were hit with maritime drones. So these are these unmanned drones that are basically like underwater or above water sea vessels that are loaded with explosives, so quite difficult to detect, really difficult to take out, particularly if you're an oil tanker, because obviously they don't have any form of defense. They're just ships that are going backwards and forwards, shuttling Russian oil. So 2 of those were hit, and it's now been reported that another tanker has been attacked in Turkish waters that was carrying sunflower oil. So this is a real ramping up, and interestingly, Russia have come out and complained about this. They've said that it's not fair that Ukraine is now attacking civilian ships. Well, obviously, I think Ukraine would say that it's not fair that Russia is attacking the whole of Ukraine. So we're in a war situation. I guess from Ukraine's point of view, they are doing what they need to do to stop the revenue and try to bring some sort of peace deal to the table. So this is a real ramping up. It's the first time that we've seen Ukraine attacking civilian vessels outside of Russian waters. So Turkey is not very happy about this. President Erdogan has come out and said that he does not condone any of this action, and then it needs to stop immediately. But I don't think it will. I think Ukraine are doing this because they want to cause maximum disruption to the Russian oil and gas industry. And interestingly, the sanctions that were recently ramped up against the oil and gas industry, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that both Rosneft, the largest company in Russia, but the largest oil company, and Lukoil, which was the overseas entity, so this is the second largest oil company, but also had operations in lots of different countries like Bulgaria and Romania, the Netherlands, the USA. It's also been hit with sanctions. So as a direct result of those sanctions being applied against those 2 entities, we are seeing a huge pullback from all of Russia's oil buyers. Now, just before we go on any further today, can I ask anyone that hasn't subscribed yet? I know more than half of you watching these videos have not. Hit that red button. Please subscribe. It helps me with the algorithm, also helps to put a smile on my face. So smash that button. Let's get back to the video. In 2023 and 2024, India became Russia's largest customer. It was buying up to 2 million barrels per day. However, we're now starting to see that pulling back. So in October, the amount of oil that India bought fell to 1.48 million barrels per day. In November, interestingly, it increased to 1.85. However, that was actually India stocking up ahead of the sanctions that it knew were coming into place, because when the USA put sanctions in place, it notified everybody that they had to conclude all of their dealings with Rosneft and Lukoil by the 21st of November. So any orders that were placed before that were still allowable. After that, you would be running the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. So Indian companies loaded up. It was basically the last chance to buy all of that discounted oil, and Russian companies were actually offering bigger discounts. However, it's now been reported that the orders for December have fallen to 600,000 barrels per day. So basically, that is less than half of what India was buying back in October. It's almost a third of what it was buying. So this represents a serious problem from Russia's point of view, because if they've lost 800,000 barrels per day delivery into India, where are they going to deliver it to? Because there aren't a lot of major markets that Russia can pivot to and deliver that oil. And it's not just India that's pulling back on these purchases. Turkey has been the third largest buyer of Russian oil over the past few years, and it was buying somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 barrels per day. However, in October, that fell to 250,000. In November, it was down to 200,000. And it's been reported that in December, it could be as low as 180,000. So again, what we're seeing here is Turkey has halved the amount of oil that it's purchasing from Russia. And if you roll forward and think about the impact of these additional sanctions, then Turkey may actually stop buying any Russian oil. And it's the same problem from Russia's point of view. It doesn't have alternative markets that it can turn to. And it's not just India and Turkey. China is also pulling back. So over the past few years, China has been buying around 2 million barrels of oil per day from Russia. Now, some of that is delivered on pipelines, so the pipeline deliveries are relatively unaffected. However, China has been pulling back on its seaborne deliveries. In October, it was down to around 1.75 million barrels per day. In November, around 1.6. And it's been reported that in December, the orders are down to around 1.5. So Russia is facing multiple problems here because it can't sell as much oil as it has been doing to its three biggest customers. And as a result of that, we are seeing the discounts on Russian oil getting even wider. It's now reported that some Russian oil is trading for $20 per barrel, and that compares to around $60 for Brent crude oil. So this is an absolute disaster from Russia's point of view because they're losing volumes to their biggest customers, and they're also seeing the price of the oil that they are managing to sell coming down significantly. So it's a double whammy, and that's going to really hurt the Russian oil industry. And as we've discussed many times before, it's not a simple case of just switching the supply off if you can't sell enough oil, because Russia doesn't have anywhere to store it. It can't just keep pumping millions of barrels of oil per day if it doesn't have anywhere to send them to. So if this continues, and if the attacks on Russian tankers also continues, that will reduce the number of tankers that Russia can load up. I recently made a video talking about the fact that Russia had around $20 billion worth of oil on the seas at the moment because it's filled all these tankers, and these tankers are just floating in the ocean waiting to be told where to go to unload all of that oil. And unfortunately, there isn't anywhere to go because the buyers are now pulling back. But once Russia gets to the point where it doesn't have anywhere else to store this oil, then it's going to have to cut back on production, and that could cause serious problems in the Russian oil industry going forward. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because obviously oil revenue is absolutely critical to the future success of the Russian economy. That's what Russia has built its economy on. It's the biggest country in the world in terms of land mass, and it has some of the biggest oil supplies. It's one of the biggest producers. It's one of the biggest exporters. So the fact that Russia is now seeing problems with this industry is intrinsically linked to the problems that are going on in the Russian economy. Historically, oil and gas accounted for up to 50% of GDP at its height. It's now down to around 25%, and Russia hasn't found a way of supplementing that fall in oil and gas revenue with anything else. So what we are seeing is a contraction in the Russian economy, and things at the moment are getting significantly worse. So I talked at the beginning of today's video about the fact that Ukraine has now changed its focus. It's been targeting oil and gas infrastructure for the past 6 or 7 months. It's really been trying to hurt Russia in an economic way by taking out those facilities. But in addition to that, it's now starting to target tankers. So it's hit 3 different tankers over the course of the past few days. And those tankers are now out of action. They're disabled. They aren't able to continue operating. So that's an issue from Russia's point of view. But I think also we've got issues with regards to insurance. So the insurance for all of the vessels that are now sailing through the Black Sea, which is where those incidents took place, has now skyrocketed. So if you're an oil tanker operator, you're going to have to pay a lot more to insure your vessel. But I think also you're going to have problems convincing all of your staff to continue sailing those vessels, because if they hear stories about ships being attacked with torpedoes and drones, then they're unlikely to want to take on that job because the risk factor has risen significantly. Up until this point, tankers were immune to any sort of action, but that's now changed. So we could see lots of other tankers deciding that they no longer want to get involved in Russian oil because they're running the risk of firstly being hit, which disables their vessel and causes them problems operationally, but secondly, it's protecting their staff. So that's definitely not going to help Russia in terms of finding more willing vessel owners to help trade their cargo. But what we've also seen in today's video is that the three biggest buyers of Russian oil, India, China, and Turkey, are all pulling back on their purchases. And this is as a result of the sanctions that were recently placed on Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil companies in Russia. Because if you're found to be dealing with either of those two entities, then that means that you yourself could be subject to secondary sanctions. So all of the financial institutions that are involved don't want to get involved in those deals. So previously, if you were buying Russian oil, you could just go to your bank and say, can you please make a payment to Rosneft or Lukoil? And that was fine because there were no sanctions in place. That doesn't apply anymore. So the financial institutions don't want to do it. Any intermediaries, so brokers or people who are handling processing and oil and all of those sort of things, don't want to get involved. And the refineries have also pulled back. So we've seen that the four biggest state-managed refineries in China have said that they will no longer buy that Russian oil. So this is a major problem from Russia's point of view because they've been existing on those three buyers. India, China, and Turkey have taken up the slack that was left after Europe turned its back on Russian oil. But Russia really now is in a problem situation because it doesn't have anywhere else to go. There isn't another large market that they can replace those three buyers with. So Russia is now really starting to feel the pinch. It's seeing its volumes going down. But in addition to that, it's also seen a crash in its oil price because if no one wants to buy your product, simple economics tells us that when demand falls and you continue with your supply, then the price will have to go down to try to find the market equilibrium. And that's what's happening in Russia right now. It's slashing the price of Urals oil. It's down to less than half of what Brent crude oil is trading at. So this is a problem because even if Russia does find a buyer, it's going to have to sell twice the amount of oil just to get the same level of income. When you halve your price, obviously you'd need to double your volume to get the same revenue. But that isn't happening. Russia is seeing a fall in volume and a fall in price. And what this means for the Russian oil industry is disaster because firstly, its profits are being slashed. It's likely that oil is now being sold at a loss because it's a very high fixed commodity business. So when you set up an oil drilling facility, there are huge costs involved in that, particularly in Russia, because a lot of the oil is in cold areas where it's frozen all of the time. So it's very expensive. So you invest billions of dollars up front, and then you pay that back over a longer period. But you have to keep passing all of those charges through. And Russian oil companies may have taken debt on as well, so they have to pay the interest on that. So it's got a high fixed cost. So when your revenue goes down, you can suddenly flip from profit to loss in a very short space of time. So that's a problem for the oil companies. But the bigger problem is volumes because they're currently operating at their maximum efficiency. So they've got millions of barrels of oil being pulled out of the ground every day. That's what you want when you set up these facilities. You get them operating and then you don't want to mess with the flows. But Russia doesn't have anywhere to store the oil, so if it can't sell it to India, China, and Turkey, then it's going to have to cut back on those flows to squeeze the amount of oil coming out of the ground. And that could cause some serious issues going forward because the last thing that you want to do is affect those flows because it's not just as simple as turning a tap on and off with oil facilities, particularly in frozen areas. So this could have long-lasting damage and cause major issues for those facilities over the next 5 to 10 years. So the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions are really starting to bite on the Russian oil industry. And in addition to that, Ukraine has now changed up its tactics to attack Russian oil tankers or any shadow fleet tankers that are running Russian oil. This is going to cause even further problems for the Russian industry at a time when the Russian economy is already starting to suffer badly. So it's going to see a further fall in revenue and put further pressure on the economy over the next 6 to 12 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for everybody that's watching this video. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon, YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, really, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.
Как кошечка.